Picture this, a packed ballroom, 2,500 people losing their minds laughing, and the reason is a grown man pretending, with total commitment, to be another grown man's foreskin. That's not a joke I made up. That actually happened. And decades later, the guy it happened to still can't tell the story without cracking up like it was yesterday. That guy is Billy Crystal. And the friend who turned himself into rumpled foreskin on a Friars Club stage back in 1992? That was Robin Williams. Now, when most people hear the name Robin Williams, their brain jumps straight to one afternoon in August 2014, one tragic ending. And look, that's real. That matters. We're going to get there. But here's the thing. If that's the only version of Robin Williams you're carrying around, you're missing almost the entire person. And nobody knows that better than Billy Crystal, who at 78 years old is still standing on stages, still doing interviews, still telling that ridiculous foreskin story because somebody has to keep the real Robin alive before the world flattens him into just a headline. So let's actually talk about who these two guys were to each other. They met in the late 1970s, grinding it out on the LA comedy circuit. Two young stand-ups working tiny rooms, years before either of them had any clue what was coming. Now here's something that might surprise you about Robin Williams. You'd think a guy that funny, that wild, must have come from chaos, right? Nope. Total opposite. He was born July 21st, 1951 in Chicago, and his dad was a senior executive at Ford. The family eventually landed in a 40-room farmhouse in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. We're talking staff on payroll, private school, class president. His classmates remember him as this warm, effortlessly hilarious kid who could crack up a whole room without even trying. Sounds charmed, right? Here's the twist. That giant house was quiet a lot of the time. His parents were busy, and young Robin spent huge chunks of his childhood basically alone, with the family's maid as his main company. He's talked about inventing entire imaginary worlds with his toy soldiers just so the silence had something in it. Funny how that works. Some of the funniest people you'll ever meet learned to perform for an audience of nobody in an empty room, way before they ever had a stage. He was good enough to win a scholarship to Juilliard, one of only 2 students accepted that year into the advanced program. The other one? Christopher Reeve. Yeah, that Christopher Reeve. But Robin walked away from it in his junior year because the electricity of a live room, a real audience reacting in real time, was pulling harder on him than any classroom ever could. He landed in the Bay Area, then LA, and after that, everything just took off. A Grammy in 1979 for Best Comedy Album, then Mork and Mindy hit, and within a single television season, this guy went from unknown comic to one of the most recognizable faces in America. And this, right here, is where Billy Crystal finds him. Not on a magazine cover, at parties, at clubs, at those Friars Club roasts, where the two of them would tear each other apart on stage with the kind of savage freedom that only exists between comedians who trust each other completely. Billy's talked about those years with this specific fondness. You know, the fondness you save for the era before things got complicated. Robin would just show up somewhere, totally uninvited, and within about 90 seconds the whole room would rearrange itself around him, because nobody could resist finding out what he'd do next. But here's the part that never made it into the glossy profiles. The part Billy Crystal saw up close because he was actually there. The comedy world of the late 70s ran on cocaine. And Robin, a guy who genuinely needed almost nothing external to light up a room, fell into it completely. People who knew him back then say he'd take cocaine from total strangers without even checking who was offering it. A fan walks up holding a spoon, and he just leans in. The director of Mork and Mindy has talked about Robin showing up to set some mornings absolutely wrecked, barely functioning. Then in March 1982, everything changed. John Belushi died. Robin had been with him the night before, in the same circles, the same substances. And when someone you were partying with hours ago dies from the exact stuff you're using yourself, that stops being an abstract danger. It becomes a mirror you cannot look away from. With his first child on the way, Robin Williams quit. Drinking, drugs, all of it, decisively, the way you quit something after you've just watched it kill someone you loved. He told People magazine years later that Belushi's death scared an entire generation in the industry straight, at least for a while. He used to wake up in the backseat of his own car, keys still in the ignition, no memory of how he got there. And then, he just stopped. What filled that gap? Cycling. He got close with a bike shop owner named Tony Tom and told him straight up that biking beat cocaine, hands down, that it had, in his own words, saved his life. That's one of the only times he ever used that exact phrase about anything in his life. And honestly, that tells you how close to the edge he knew he'd been standing. That sobriety held for 20 years. 2 decades where Robin Williams built the body of work that defined a generation. Good Morning Vietnam in '87 let his improv genius run wild inside an actual character. A lot of those radio monologues were his own invention, riffed in long, unscripted bursts the editors then had to wrestle into shape. Dead Poet Society showed the total opposite gear: stillness, restraint, a teacher whose passion came through in quiet conviction instead of chaos. Aladdin let his voice loose from his body for the first time. Animators built whole sequences around him just riffing in the booth, because what he came up with on the spot beat anything they could have written. Mrs. Doubtfire turned a story about a father terrified of losing his kids into one of the decade's biggest comedies, built from hours of improvised gold the editors had to cut down. The Birdcage paired him with Nathan Lane, and he played it generous, letting his co-star grab the loudest laughs while he held the film's heart together. And in 1997, after 3 previous nominations, Good Will Hunting finally won him the Oscar, a performance built on stillness and listening. That park bench scene where he tells Matt Damon, "It's not your fault," becoming one of the most quoted moments in American film. And through every single bit of that, Billy Crystal was there. Not some industry acquaintance who shook his hand at parties, an actual friend. The guy who got turned into a body part at a public roast. The guy who could call Robin up and just have him show up. They ran in the same circle as Robin's closest friend from those Juilliard days, Christopher Reeve. And that friendship shows you everything you need to know about who Robin really was underneath all the noise. After Reeve's catastrophic riding accident in 1995 left him paralyzed, facing the darkest thoughts a person can have, Robin Williams walked into that hospital room dressed as a Russian doctor, doing a ridiculous accent, and made his oldest friend laugh for the first time since the accident. Reeve later said that single moment of relief helped him decide to keep living. Let that sink in for a second. A joke, delivered at exactly the right moment, by exactly the right person, may have saved a man's life. That's the story Billy Crystal carries around as proof of what the public record keeps getting wrong. That with Robin, the comedy was never separate from the caring. It was the caring. It was just delivered in the only language Robin fully trusted. They also built something real together publicly. Comic relief. The benefit specials Billy ran for years alongside Robin and Whoopi Goldberg, raising tens of millions of dollars for homelessness relief. That's over 2 decades of unglamorous, sustained work between 3 massively famous people who could have just coasted and didn't. It's one of the quieter parts of Robin's legacy, and it's one of the parts Billy brings up most when he wants people to actually understand who his friend was. Now, 2003. The sobriety breaks. Robin's off filming in Alaska, isolated, feeling scared in a way he later described as the single most dangerous state for someone with his history. He told himself it'd just be 1 drink. Within a week, he was buying so much alcohol, he said he sounded like a wind chime walking down the street, bottles just clinking in the bag. He talked about it later with brutal honesty. There's a voice that tells an alcoholic he can drink again, and he said it's the same voice that calls to you from the edge of a tall building. He went to rehab in 2006, relapsed again, checked back into treatment at the Hazelden Foundation in 2014, just months before the end. But here's the part almost nobody understood at the time, including Robin himself. That renewed drinking wasn't just the old addiction resurfacing, it was the early edge of something completely different. In late 2013, weird disconnected symptoms started showing up. Trouble sleeping, heartburn, a slight tremor in his left hand that everyone, even his doctors, chalked up to an old shoulder injury. An anxiety that made no logical sense given anything happening in his actual life. His wife, Susan Schneider Williams, later wrote about those months in an essay that stands as one of the most devastating, important things ever written about brain disease from someone who lived inside it with him. She called it, "The terrorist inside my husband's brain." By winter, it got harder to explain away. Paranoia, delusions, memory loss so severe that while filming Night at the Museum 3, he struggled to hold on to his own lines. A man whose entire career was built on instant verbal invention, suddenly unable to trust his mind to keep a single sentence in place. Susan has said Robin knew, with a terrible clarity, that he was losing his mind. And true to form, he kept the worst of it hidden from almost everyone, because he'd spent his whole life being the guy who made the room feel better, and he wasn't about to stop, even as the disease made it harder every single day. By the end, there was no more hiding it. A slow, shuffling walk. Trouble finding words mid-sentence. That left hand wouldn't stop trembling. He lost the ability to judge distance and depth. Susan described a specific, awful symptom. A frozen, mask-like expression that would settle over his face, stealing the mobility that had always made his expression so alive on screen. Think about that. The man whose face was his greatest comedic instrument was losing physical control of it, piece by piece, and he knew it was happening, and there was no name for it yet. The diagnosis only came after his death: Lewy body dementia. a degenerative brain disease that, in its early stages, mimics Parkinson's and can produce exactly the paranoia, anxiety, and cognitive slippage that had been quietly taking him apart for nearly a year. Nobody, not his doctors, not his family, not Robin himself, had a name for it while there was still time to explain what was actually happening inside his own head. He thought he was simply losing his mind for no reason, with no way back. He said goodnight to Susan on the evening of August 10th, 2014. Those were the last words he ever said to her. He took his own life the next morning. He was 63. The whole world grieved, hard and fast, the way you only see with a handful of public deaths. But for the people who actually knew him, for Billy Crystal, who'd spent decades getting savaged and adored in equal measure by this man, that grief was a completely different animal, personal, still is. And what Billy's tried to do ever since, in every interview where the subject comes up, is refuse the flattening. He won't lead with the ending. He leads with the foreskin joke. He leads with the stand-up rooms, the Friars Club roasts, the specific electricity of being around Robin Williams when there was no ticket required, when it was just two comedians trying to make each other laugh harder than anyone else could. He tells the story about Alan King roasting him so brutally that Billy had to lean over and warn him his actual mother was sitting at table 5, and Alan King, without missing a beat, just addressed her directly. Billy's mother stood right up and told the whole room not to get her started. That was the world Robin Williams lived in for 30 years. Generous, merciless, and built entirely on love disguised as insults. Billy Crystal's point across every interview, every stage is this. The real tragedy of Robin Williams isn't just that he died too young, though he absolutely did. It's that the disease stole something from him before it ever took his life. His words, his timing, his trust in the very instrument that had defined him since he was a lonely kid inventing stories for toy soldiers in a house too big for anyone to notice him in. And it's that he spent his final year performing the bravest role of his entire career, convincing everyone around him he was just tired, just overworked, just Robin being Robin, while privately terrified his own mind was slipping away and nobody could tell him why. At 78, Billy Crystal carries both versions of his friend at once. Not the sanitized public memory, not the single image the world settled on that August. The whole person. The man who could make 2,500 people howl pretending to be a body part. The man who quit drugs the morning after losing a friend to them and stayed clean for 2 decades through sheer will. The man who lost a fight against an enemy that had no name yet, one that nobody around him could identify until it was too late. And he still tells the foreskin story. And he still laughs every single time. Because that laugh is the truest tribute he knows how to give. So next time you think of Robin Williams, don't just think of the ending. Think of the friend. Think of the guy who showed up dressed as a Russian doctor to save someone's will to live. That's the version worth keeping. If this hit you the way it hit me, do me a favor. Smash that like button, drop a comment with your favorite Robin Williams memory or movie, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. See you in the next video.